What if everything you know about time is wrong? What if the year you live in, your century, your history, your very timeline, was a human invention? Imagine waking up one morning to learn that it's not 2025, it's 1725. It sounds impossible, a conspiracy too vast to believe. But deep within Europe's historical records lies a mystery that refuses to die. It's called the phantom time hypothesis. And if it's true, nearly 300 years of history, from the year 614 to 911 AD, never actually happened. They were added later, fabricated, inserted into the calendar by rulers and priests who wanted to reshape time itself. To understand how such a deception could even be possible, we have to step back to the moment when humans first tried to measure time. For most of human history, time wasn't a number. It was a rhythm: the sun's rise, the moon's cycle, the changing of seasons. Farmers didn't care about the year, they cared about when to plant. Kings didn't speak in centuries, they spoke in reigns. It wasn't until the Roman Empire that a structured, numbered calendar began to rule daily life. In 45 BCE, Julius Caesar introduced what became known as the Julian calendar, a reform meant to fix the drifting Roman year. It divided the year into 365 days, with a leap year every 4. For the first time, the empire's dates matched the stars again. But even Caesar's solution wasn't perfect. The year was about 11 minutes too long. Over centuries, that tiny error accumulated, slowly pushing the dates out of alignment with the seasons. By the time the Middle Ages arrived, the spring equinox, which should have fallen around March 21st, was drifting toward early March. The Church noticed. For them, this wasn't just astronomy, it was theology. Easter's date was calculated based on the equinox. If the calendar was wrong, the holiest day of the year was being celebrated at the wrong time. So, in 1582, Pope Gregory XIII made the bold decision to fix it. He introduced a new system, the Gregorian calendar, that skipped 10 days to bring the equinox back to its proper place. Thursday, October 4th, 1582, was followed by Friday, October 15th. 10 days simply vanished. But that fix revealed something strange. The Julian calendar had drifted about 10 days over 15 centuries. Mathematically, that meant it should have been 13 days off, not 10, if it had been running since Caesar's time. That tiny inconsistency, just 3 missing days, would later spark one of the strangest theories in modern history. In 1991, a German historian named Heribert Illig noticed that discrepancy. He began asking questions nobody had dared to ask. What if the problem wasn't the math, but the history itself? What if some of those 15 centuries never happened? Illig's idea was radical. He claimed that roughly 297 years of our recorded past, specifically the period from 614 to 911 AD, had been fabricated. According to his research, these phantom centuries were inserted during the early medieval era, possibly under the direction of the Holy Roman Empire Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II. Their goal, Illig suggested, was to legitimize Otto's reign by placing it in the symbolic year 1000, a number that carried enormous religious significance. If Illig was right, the entire period we call the early Middle Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, never really existed. The events of that era, from the reign of Charlemagne to the foundations of the Holy Roman Empire, would all be historical mirages. It sounds absurd, but Illig pointed to evidence that, at first glance, seemed disturbingly consistent. Across much of Europe, the archaeological record between the 7th and 10th centuries appeared strangely thin. Few new cities were built. Architecture and technology seemed to stagnate. Written sources were scarce, and those that existed often contained inconsistencies or anachronisms, details that didn't quite fit the timeline. He wasn't the first to notice something off about this period. Historians had long referred to it as the Dark Ages, precisely because so little was known. Entire centuries seemed to pass with barely a trace of human activity. To Illig, that wasn't a mystery, it was a clue. He believed those centuries were invented later, filled in by scribes who copied older documents, changed dates, and fabricated events to make history appear continuous. But why would anyone want to create fake time? Illig's theory offered a motive rooted in politics and power. Around the turn of the first millennium, the Church's influence was immense. The idea of the year 1000 held apocalyptic meaning, the 1000th anniversary of Christ's birth, a supposed sign of divine renewal. For an emperor like Otto III, aligning his rule with that sacred milestone could elevate his status to near messianic levels. To do that, however, the timeline needed adjusting. A few missing centuries could conveniently transform the 7th century into the 10th, placing Otto exactly where he wanted to be, ruler of the new millennium. It wasn't just numbers, it was narrative control. Time itself became a political instrument. To the medieval mind, history was not an objective record. It was divine order, a story written by God and interpreted by kings and popes. If history didn't fit prophecy, then perhaps it was history that needed to change. Illig claimed that during this process of reform, scribes and scholars extended the timeline. Chronicles were copied and redated. Events were shifted forward. A king who ruled in 700 might be reimagined as ruling in 1000. When the dust settled, nearly 3 centuries of imaginary time had been silently added. Critics dismissed the idea as pseudo-history, but even skeptics admitted there were strange coincidences. For example, the life of Charlemagne, supposedly born in 742 and crowned emperor in 800, has long been shrouded in uncertainty. The surviving documents about him were all written decades later, often by the Church, and contain contradictions. Some of his achievements, schools, architecture, governance, seemed oddly advanced for the era, more fitting of a later age. Illig suggested that Charlemagne may never have existed as a single man at all, but rather as a mythologized composite of various rulers from different times merged into one legendary figure to fill the missing centuries. Then there's the question of architecture. Between the fall of Rome in the 5th century and the rise of Romanesque architecture in the 10th, there's an architectural void. Few major buildings survive from those phantom centuries. Archaeologists have noted that construction styles and materials leap forward suddenly around the year 1000, as if centuries of evolution happened overnight. Could it be that those centuries never occurred, or that the records were simply lost? Illig's hypothesis fascinated the public not because it was proven, but because it felt possible. History, after all, is written by the victors. What if those victors had written too much? Imagine the power to reshape time. If an emperor could insert years, he could change lineage, prophecy, legitimacy, even destiny. Dates on coins, chronicles, and documents would follow his word. Over generations, nobody would question it. The illusion would become history itself. As the idea spread, researchers began re-examining medieval sources. Astronomers looked to the sky for answers, since celestial events can be dated precisely. Total solar eclipses, for instance, leave exact timestamps in time. If 297 years were missing, the pattern of eclipses recorded in ancient texts would no longer match modern astronomical calculations. Yet, according to Illig, several early medieval eclipse records didn't align with expected positions, as if they had been back-calculated rather than observed. Still, the evidence was thin. Mainstream historians pointed out that most discrepancies could be explained by copying errors, lost documents, or the chaos of medieval record-keeping. But for many who encountered the theory, it wasn't about proof, it was about perspective. If history could be altered once, what else could be rewritten? As we look back across the centuries, our trust in time feels absolute. We mark birthdays, anniversaries, millennia. But every date we know, every number on a coin, every monument inscription, rests on the fragile assumption that the chain of years was never broken. What if that chain was forged in part from fiction? In the next part, we'll explore Illig's evidence in detail, how astronomy, papal decrees, and imperial ambition collided to produce one of the strangest mysteries ever hidden inside the calendar. Because if time itself can be manipulated, then maybe so can history. The mystery begins not with lost empires or vanished kings, but with something far more precise: mathematics. When Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar in 1582, his astronomers calculated how far the Julian calendar had drifted from the solar year. Their result was clear. The old system had accumulated about 10 days of error since its creation under Julius Caesar. 10 days in 15 centuries. But if that were true, it meant the Julian calendar's drift had been slower than it should have been. Mathematically, there should have been nearly 13 days of error, not 10. Somewhere, roughly 3 centuries of time were missing. To Heribert Illig, this wasn't a coincidence, it was a clue. He argued that if the drift was shorter than expected, it meant fewer years had actually passed, because 300 of them had never happened at all. To understand Illig's reasoning, we need to revisit how calendars work. The Earth takes roughly 365.2422 days to orbit the Sun. The Julian calendar rounded that to 365.25 days, which means it gained about 3 extra days every 4 centuries. Over long stretches of time, those extra minutes add up. But if the Gregorian reformers in 1582 only needed to remove 10 days, not 13, it would mean the Julian calendar had been in use for only about 1200 years, not the 1500 officially recorded. This mathematical oddity became the seed of Illig's hypothesis, the missing 297 years between 614 and 911 AD. He began examining the historical record of those centuries. What he found, or believed he found, was a strange emptiness. Europe, after the fall of Rome, seemed to vanish into a fog. Fewer chronicles were written. Archaeological layers grew thin. Artistic styles stagnated. Even population estimates seemed to dip without explanation. When civilization finally reappeared, in the form of the Holy Roman Empire under Otto III, it looked startlingly advanced compared to what came before. The transition was too sharp, too sudden. Illig described it as if Europe had gone to sleep for 3 centuries and suddenly awakened. At the center of his theory stood a single figure, Emperor Otto III. Born around 980 AD, Otto was a visionary obsessed with the idea of the translatio imperii, the transfer of empire from Rome to his own rule. He wanted to be seen as the divine continuation of Rome and the fulfillment of Christian prophecy. The symbolic year 1000 carried immense power. It marked 1000 years since the birth of Christ, a moment many believed heralded the end of the world or the beginning of a new divine age. Illig proposed that Otto, with the help of Pope Sylvester II, created the year 1000 by adding centuries that never occurred. In other words, the real year might have been 700-something, but Otto declared it to be 1000. Doing so would place his empire at the dawn of the new millennium, fulfilling the prophecies and cementing his legitimacy as a ruler chosen by God. How would such a manipulation even work? Through control of documents, monasteries, and the church, the institutions that defined time. In medieval Europe, time wasn't measured by scientists or governments. It was measured by monks. Every document, from royal decrees to tax records, was dated in the year of our Lord. The church's scribes copied and recopied ancient texts, deciding what to preserve and what to destroy. In such a system, where only a handful of scholars could even read, adjusting the timeline wasn't impossible. It was frighteningly easy. Illig argued that Otto and Sylvester could have ordered the redating of key documents, simply moving earlier events forward in time. Chronicles from the 7th and 8th centuries could be relabeled as 10th century events. Over generations, the illusion would solidify. By the time anyone noticed, the fake centuries would be woven into the structure of history itself. One of Illig's most provocative claims concerned Charlemagne, the legendary first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. According to official history, Charlemagne lived from 742 to 814 AD, squarely within Illig's phantom period. His empire stretched across modern France and Germany, his reforms shaped Europe, and his legacy gave birth to modern Western identity. But Illig believed Charlemagne never existed, at least not as a single man. He proposed that the stories of Charlemagne were a mixture of real rulers from earlier centuries, blended and exaggerated by later historians. To him, the image of Charlemagne as a perfect Christian emperor, educated, just, and divinely chosen, was too idealized. It felt like propaganda created to legitimize later rulers, possibly Otto himself. Even the art and architecture of the time seemed suspicious. The so-called Carolingian Renaissance, said to have revived learning and culture after centuries of darkness, appeared too advanced and too brief. How could such sophistication appear suddenly, vanish, and then reappear 300 years later in the real Renaissance? To Illig, it was evidence of duplication. The same stories, styles, and achievements told twice, once in a fabricated Dark Age and once in the later, authentic one. Archaeological data also raised questions. When researchers excavated sites from the supposed early Middle Ages, they found fewer artifacts than expected. Pottery styles, building techniques, and coinage changed little over centuries. Some layers that should represent hundreds of years were only a few centimeters thick. Illig argued that this wasn't just coincidence, it was the physical proof of missing time. He wasn't alone in noticing these anomalies. A number of historians before him had commented on the strange stillness of the 7th to 9th centuries. But where others saw social collapse or poor preservation, Illig saw fabrication. Then came the astronomical argument. If centuries had been invented, the recorded positions of celestial events, eclipses, comets, planetary alignments, wouldn't line up with modern calculations. Some medieval records of eclipses do, in fact, appear off by several years. Illig suggested this was because those records were not true observations, but later reconstructions added into forged chronologies. His critics, however, quickly responded. Astronomers pointed out that ancient Chinese, Arab, and Byzantine records all documented the same eclipses, and those records matched modern calculations perfectly. If 297 years were missing, those alignments would be impossible. The sky, after all, cannot be forged. Historians also pushed back against the supposed archaeological gap. They argued that the so-called emptiness of the early Middle Ages was an illusion created by uneven preservation and the loss of records. Wars, plagues, and material decay had erased much of what once existed. The transition from the Roman to medieval world had been chaotic, not non-existent. They pointed to dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, as evidence. Each ring corresponds to 1 year, and these sequences can be matched across continents. If Illig were right, there would be a clear gap of 297 missing rings somewhere in the global record. There isn't. The trees kept growing. The ice cores kept forming. The Earth didn't skip centuries. Still, the appeal of Illig's theory wasn't in its data, but in its audacity. It dared to suggest that time itself, the most fundamental truth we know, could be manipulated. It resonated in an age increasingly aware of misinformation, revisionism, and media control. Illig's hypothesis soon expanded beyond his own work. Other writers picked up the idea, weaving it into theories about lost civilizations, hidden technologies, and ancient conspiracies. Some claimed that entire chunks of history were fabricated worldwide, not just in Europe. Others linked it to apocalyptic prophecies or alien interventions. The phantom time hypothesis had evolved from academic speculation into cultural myth. But even within its original form, Illig's version was chillingly simple. He didn't claim every historian lied, only that they trusted false foundations. Once the church had adjusted the calendar, every subsequent scholar inherited that illusion. For 1,000 years, people would have lived inside a false chronology, unaware that centuries had been added before their ancestors were even born. The deeper Illig dug, the more he saw patterns that seemed to confirm his suspicion. The lack of development in weapon technology, the repetition of royal names and lineages, the abrupt architectural leaps, all, to him, pointed toward artificial continuity. And yet, for all his passion, there was something unsettling about his theory. To accept it meant accepting that an empire had successfully rewritten not just history, but time itself, and that no one had ever noticed. As the debate grew, one question began to dominate. If those 3 centuries were fake, what was the real year? Illig calculated that our calendar was off by 297 years, which meant that the true year, instead of being 2025, would be 1728. humanity would not be living in the 21st century at all, but in the 18th, a bizarre conclusion that fascinated the public even as scientists rejected it. But whether true or not, the idea of fabricated time tapped into something ancient, the fear that reality can be rewritten. Every empire, every religion, every nation has shaped its own version of history. But what Illig suggested was deeper, that by altering dates, we could alter existence itself. That by changing the number of the year, we could change where humanity stood in the cosmic story. Perhaps that's why, even decades after Illig proposed his theory, it refuses to die. It lingers because it challenges the one thing we never question, the ticking of the clock. In the next part, we'll explore the aftermath, how the phantom time hypothesis reshaped modern understanding of history, what science says against it, and what it reveals about our fragile faith in reality. Because even if Illig was wrong, the idea that time itself could be edited might be closer to truth than we think. Time. The one constant we believe we can trust. Every sunrise, every second, every date in every book, all built on the illusion that history flows in a straight line. But what if that line bends? What if, hidden inside the pages of history, time itself has been rewritten more than once? Heribert Illig's phantom time hypothesis was more than a theory. It was a test of faith. Not religious faith, but faith in the very structure of reality. By proposing that nearly 300 years of history never existed, he didn't just question medieval Europe. He questioned everything, our calendars, our ancestors, and the meaning of now. After Illig's claims spread in the early 1990s, historians, archaeologists, and scientists across Europe scrambled to examine his evidence. They didn't just reject it, they dissected it piece by piece. The first blow came from astronomy. The positions of the sun, moon, and stars are predictable across millennia. If 297 years had been added to history, astronomical records from multiple civilizations would no longer match. But they did. Ancient Chinese astronomers, Byzantine chroniclers, and Arab scholars all documented eclipses and planetary conjunctions that align perfectly with modern astronomical models. If centuries had been fabricated, the sky would have betrayed the lie. It didn't. Then came archaeology. In England, France, and Germany, excavations revealed settlements, graves, tools, and churches datable to every century Illig had claimed was fake. Radiocarbon dating confirmed continuous human activity through the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. Artifacts from those eras, coins, pottery, textiles, were real, not retroactive inventions. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, provided perhaps the most decisive evidence. Each ring marks a single year of growth. When tree ring sequences from medieval timbers were compared, there were no gaps, no missing centuries. The Earth had kept perfect time, even if human calendars had not. Illig's theory, by the mid-2000s, had been scientifically dismantled. But something curious happened. The idea refused to die. It took on a second life, not as history, but as metaphor. Because in a strange way, Illig's hypothesis captured a deeper truth. History is edited, maybe not by inventing centuries, but by rewriting stories. Every generation reshapes the past to justify its present. Every empire erases what it fears. Every nation adjusts its memory to protect its myths. Time itself may be linear, but history is political. In the centuries following Otto III, rulers and religious leaders continued to shape calendars to their needs. When Britain finally adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1752, 11 days were erased overnight. People protested, believing their lives had been shortened, but no one had lost days, only illusions. Even today, time remains negotiable. Russia, Greece, and much of the Orthodox world clung to the Julian calendar until the 20th century. In Ethiopia, it's still 2018. In China, lunar time governs festivals. In science, atomic clocks now define seconds so precisely that we occasionally have to add a leap second to keep the planet in sync. It's almost poetic. Even in our most precise measurements, time slips through our fingers. Illig's idea, though false in its literal form, serves as a warning. a reminder of how fragile our collective memory is. Consider this. Nearly all we know of the early Middle Ages comes from handwritten manuscripts copied by monks. A single scribe could erase a decade with the stroke of a pen. A war could destroy centuries of archives. A ruler could reshape an entire era simply by commanding his chroniclers to correct the record. It's happened before. The pharaohs of Egypt erased their predecessors from temple walls to claim their legacies. The Roman Senate condemned emperors to damnatio memoriae, the erasure of memory itself. Stalin removed purged officials from photographs, rewriting the Soviet past in real time. Even now, textbooks change with politics, shaping how entire generations remember their nations. Perhaps Illig was wrong about when history was fabricated, but not about whether it can be. There's also a psychological allure to the phantom time hypothesis. It gives shape to an ancient anxiety that something isn't quite right with our world. Why does history sometimes feel shorter than it should? Why do vast stretches of time seem empty, disconnected, out of rhythm? It's the same impulse that fuels every great conspiracy, the belief that beneath the surface of order lies hidden design. For some, Illig's hypothesis wasn't about medieval dates. It was about control, the idea that someone, somewhere, dictates what is real. And in that sense, it mirrors a deeper truth about human civilization. We don't just measure time, we manufacture it. Think about it. There is no cosmic clock ticking the year 2025. Time doesn't care about numbers. Our calendars are fictions, agreements we've made with one another to keep chaos at bay. Every year is a human construction. Every century is a story. When Illig asked, "What if the year 2025 is really 1728?" he was unknowingly asking something far more profound. What if time is a story we tell ourselves to stay sane? Because in a way, that's exactly what it is. The calendar is not reality, it's a map of belief. It gives us direction, continuity, and meaning. It lets us imagine that we're part of a grand, unbroken journey from past to future. But beneath that comforting order lies chaos. Moments forgotten, rewritten, and rearranged until history itself becomes a patchwork of truths and fictions. As modern science dismantled Illig's claims, philosophers began to see his theory differently. They viewed it as a metaphor for the human relationship with time, our desperate need to quantify something we barely understand. Time, after all, isn't just numbers on a page. It's memory. It's perception. It's the distance between what was and what we remember. And memories, like histories, can be manipulated. The phantom time hypothesis endures not because it's true, but because it reflects a deeper fear that our entire civilization could be built on forgotten lies, that what we call reality might just be a well-told story that started centuries too late. In the end, even the strongest refutations couldn't erase the unsettling feeling the theory left behind. What if time can be rewritten, not by emperors or popes, but by us, every time we forget, edit, or distort our past? History, in that sense, is a living illusion. It changes as we change. What we record, what we erase, what we choose to believe, all of it bends the timeline, not in years, but in meaning. And so the real question isn't whether 3 centuries were fabricated. The real question is how much of what we believe about the past survives only because we choose to believe it. The truth is this: the calendar may be accurate, but our perception of time never is. We live suspended between memories and expectations, calling it the present, while the real measure of history, what truly happened, slips quietly beyond reach. If time can be measured, it can be mistaken. If it can be mistaken, it can be rewritten. So perhaps the most haunting part of the phantom time hypothesis isn't that those missing centuries never existed. It's that we may never know how much of our history did. Because time doesn't just move forward, it folds, it repeats, it hides. And somewhere between the truth and the lie, we call it history.